Margaret Galvan is Assistant Professor of Visual Rhetoric in the Department of English at the University of Florida. Her research examines how visual culture operates within the print media of feminist and queer social movements in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Her first book, Invisible Archives: Queer and Feminist Visual Culture in the 1980s, explores how publishing practices and archives have shaped understandings of the visual within feminist and queer activism. This episode is being released on World AIDS Day. Margaret's book is partly focused on the tragedy of AIDS for a generation of people that saw the virus disproportionately attack people on the margins. The prejudicial social engineering that created a system of disposability around AIDS meant that those who were suffering had to use every point of leverage at their disposal. Galvan talks about the ways that artists responded when the emergence of HIV/AIDS in the 1980s fractured their communities. She says artists scrambled to preserve their queer worlds, not only through direct action on the street, but also through their own artwork. We talk in particular about Nan Goldin's enduring work and the way that it politically activates her community and their losses through image and text, and how Goldin refused to allow HIV/AIDS to remain a shameful private matter. Galvan's book is all about archiving as a strategy, so there's a fair amount of time spent here discussing different approaches to the archive, how archives function politically, and why certain archives are seen as relevant while others are not, or certain ways of expressing desire and identity are seen as a threat. Galvan reads across archives to sense how sense memory is preserved by an archive, or how memory is rendered immobilized through a process of arresting the archive. If texts are hybrid, multiple, and meaningful to multiple people, then they can also, Margaret says, be a guide for future activism. We've all seen the ways that a text can change the course of someone's thinking, and how that detour through a different way of being can open up new pathways for political action. What I find really compelling, though, about Galvan's book and her way of approaching this paradigm is that she never abandons a sense of the historical context in favor of analyzing the text's content. The two things are inextricable, and that means we get a picture of the ways that texts present the present politically. This is a book, Invisible Archives, that I really want us to kind of primarily focus on. This just came out from University of Minnesota Press, and studies, as the subtitle points out, queer and feminist visual culture in the 1980s. Queer and feminist visual culture, and in particular within this decade, that really kind of developed certain tactics. Maybe it could be argued, and I think what you suggest in the book is that one of the defining characteristics of queer and feminist zine making and what I would call graphic storytelling is its kind of like interstitial position in relation to like the much heralded like underground comic scene of the era, which, I like that you just sort of bluntly say has this normalized misogyny to it that is even like celebrated. Which I've always found strange in terms of the kind of inheriting of that tradition even today. So position in relationship to that, and then also the respectability politics of the feminist movement, the kind of mainstream feminist movement. So I'm really interested in this through line of the book because it does seem to offer not only insight into that history, but also a rereading of comic studies, meaning that there's this kind of history of thinking about the struggle for comics legitimacy. Even so, there isn't a lot of discussion of how like that struggle for legitimacy, getting a spine on the comic book so it can be sorted into an archive, extends into like these oppositional political movements. How did engaging, I guess, with the archive that you engage with in the book help you sort of visualize and analyze that struggle?
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. I'm super excited to talk about this project. It's been a long time in the making, and especially with the comics that I'm looking at, these feminist underground comics. It's really interesting because some of them, they wanted to be in feminist bookstores. They, wanted to be, and they were talking about and documenting the feminist movement, but they were, in some cases, a little bit too irreverent for the movement. Or folks at the bookstores knew about the underground. They knew it was super misogynist. And so they, in some cases, thought that these were women masquerading as men making comics, or men masquerading as women, excuse me. And so there was just a really difficult uh, struggle to get their stuff into bookstores. Also, sometimes they're, lovingly making fun of the movement, and there's often humor is a little difficult. Like, are you punching down? Like, not everyone gets a joke.
Mm-hmm.
There's,
Mm-hmm.
there's tons of anthologies too about feminist humor and the difficult negotiations with that. And so people like Art Spiegelman or R. Crumb, sort of have been a really important center point for a lot of people to be inspired and build comics on. But then there's all these sort of larger histories of comics by feminist individuals, by queer folk that are sometimes happening right alongside these comics. Sometimes they're happening in grassroots movement newspapers, and they're just not as well known about. And so we talk about women's comics and queer comics as a more contemporary phenomenon, but they're really happening also in this time and were really important. But they had definitely have difficulties of circulation at the time, which then impacts how they're remembered afterwards. Although some of that, there's some there is a move to recover and republish these comics now, and there's been Fantagraphics has done a box set of the women's comics, which is a long running series, and just this year released a volume of Tits and Clits, which was also a long running series in the 70s and in the 80s. So that sort of maybe bodes that maybe some of the times are changing. We can remember these things again and sort of bring them forward with us. Because a lot of the politics and things they talk about, unfortunately are coming back. Like, they talk about reproductive rights, and that's become something that we're talking a lot more now that it's under threat in a lot of the U.S.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, lots of different things coming up for me in relation to what you were just talking about. But since you mentioned at the end there the kind of revanchist forces, or just like the kind of right wing backlash, I wanted to mention that I collaborate sometimes with Stacey Balkin, who also teaches at like the university level in Florida, like you. And she talks about like the obvious right wing backlash against anything that indicates wokeness, so called, but also all these different kinds of resistance that are brewing in that state. So I think she just kind of wants to resist the reductiveness with which people sometimes look down upon Florida as this one homogeneous thing politically. So I kind of wondered if you wanted to talk about the context in which you teach and how the techniques of queer and feminist visual culture can maybe help build a relationship to movement organizing that does create space for left politics, that gives it oxygen and energy. I ask because like there is this idea in your book that a text like Caught Looking, for example, can serve as a guide for future activism. What did you mean there? Do you see, like, how do you see the scene in Florida?
Yeah, so I teach at the University of Florida, and actually, Stacy's a good friend of mine. We both went to grad school together,
Uh-huh.
um, in a large program. Didn't really weren't like at different points, so we didn't really like take courses together. But then we both got these jobs in Florida
Mm-hmm.
around the same time. So it's been she does amazing activist work. So it's been really vital to being in contact with her and to also, build contacts across the university at this time when, there is this backlash that in some ways wants to constrain what we do in the classroom. But up until now, some of that's been, it's like the panopticon. They want us to surveil and censor
Mm-hmm.
ourselves and keep and scare us into not teaching these things. But I was literally my job title was about feminist and queer visual narrative. That's what they wanted me to teach. So I'm doing my job by teaching those things. My
Mm-hmm.
students also I mean, they're the ones who fill me with hope right now, that we can make a turn, that this stuff is really vital. They're really invested in what I teach, and in fact, they want to, they want to engage with these subjects. They think these subjects are very vital.
Mm-hmm.
I think because of the subjects I teach, I have a lot of queer and trans students in my classes. Um, and so all of this, I say, sort of guide for future activism, because it's providing, in sort of remembering this material, it's providing a way it can be reactivated again. So I talk a little bit
Mm-hmm.
about the job of the Interference Archive, which is a social movement archive in Brooklyn, New York, formed around the same time as the Occupy movement, but not like directly out of it. And they, they're not an official archive space, so they don't have, like the temperature control and all of those things. So their interest is really collecting things that exist in multiples, because, manuscripts should go into a place where they have, the ability to preserve them for long-term storage. But the idea is, part of it is preserving them for the moment, right? Or preserving them
Mm-hmm.
for like use in the moment and to inspire future activism. And so, some of this stuff I'm studying, as I was growing up, this stuff was still being published, but there was no way I had access to it. Like, it was very small, um, circulation, like it just was in different spaces, of circulation. And so for folks growing up in like a younger generation, we didn't know about this stuff, but this stuff is super vital. So, I have students who, their point of reference, sort of earlier generation, um, in comics is like manga is something in the 90s that talks a lot about like gender and
Mm-hmm.
sexuality, and allows there to be a more space, for expression of non-normative or gender nonconformity. So that's a really important point. A lot of cartoonists also are inspired by that style. It's not to negate that, but also to say, well, there's these other things that were being produced, that we can find connection to, right? Intergenerational connection, that we can sort of start to like rebuild a sense of a timeline that might include these things again, and to also be inspired by them. I think a lot, about, if you've seen Cheryl Dunier's Watermelon Woman. Have you seen this film?
I have not.
It's so great. So it's from the 90s, I believe, and she's a Black lesbian documentarian, and she does a sort of fake documentary where she creates this early Black lesbian figure, in Hollywood, and she sort of, studies and like is researching her genealogy. But part of the point is
Mm.
there that, having these sort of points of connection to the past, and sort of seeing that these things were happening in the past, that people were sort of, living, their lives as they were on their own terms, sort of living as openly as they could as LGBTQ people, advocating for social justice. That can be a big point of inspiration. It can be really important. So I have like
Mm-hmm.
students doing research now, um, about how what's happening with trans politics is very similar to what was happening, um, in terms of the Johns Committee, which was a sort of Florida-based, it was Florida-based, sort of version of McCarthyism. And when they figured out they couldn't go against, they wanted to like root out like Black folks, and the NAACP was really well organized. They decided to go against LGBTQ folks instead, and fired a lot of public employees, in the state of Florida. And so, that's sort of a sad point of, like looking back at that history then, and people
Mm-hmm.
talking about losing their jobs, and then looking forward now. But it is also a point of strength to sort of think about what can we do, and how can we, when we know this history,
Mm-hmm.
how might it inspire us, in the present moment. And so that's sort of what I mean. That's a long form answer.
No, but it's great. It's like really rich with all kinds of things, like the idea that, as you say in the book, archiving can be a strategy for, allowing the artwork of women to survive. And there are people in these kind of key positions historically who had to occupy multiple positions and do all these different kinds of jobs, and sustain so much energy and like a sense of purpose in order to do that work of like allowing forms of representation and expression to survive. And I wonder about that in relationship to what you mentioned there around like spaces of archiving. It does feel like part of the lesson of, for example, Nan Goldin's legacy is that, these spaces have to be created and curated and kind of safeguarded. Here in Halifax, Nova Scotia, we have places like the Khyber Center that become spaces of kind of subversive artistic practice, but they need to be defended. It's hard to like make a business case, as it were. Um, and so I guess like, what do you think? What have you learned? I guess about the energy it takes to sustain the kind of energy and dedication required in archival practice. Because, like, from your perspective, archivists are activists in many instances in the movements you're describing. So, like, how are these women able to migrate between all these different practices and keep going?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think so at the time a lot of these artists were active. I trace the emergence of a lot of grassroots LGBTQ archives. And so there was a sense of, there were people who were going back to um, you know, reading like Virginia Woolf's diaries at this time, and were sort of trying to start to build their own archives. And so there was this huge sense that we need to document this ourselves. We need to keep track of this stuff. So our own artistic practice in some ways is documenting, because it's not necessarily going to be talked about or documented correctly or seen or
Mm-hmm.
understood correctly in the time. Like,
Mm-hmm.
no one's going to get it right at the time unless we get it right, or afterwards, right? Both of those things, I think, are active. And so we see that in different ways in the different artists I study. Uh, but then, it's about, well, what happens to the archival spaces, right? Like, how do we maintain them? And
Mm-hmm.
so there's a long history of, the Lesbian History Archives in Brooklyn, New York is staunchly independent. They have grassroots funded their own space in the early 1990s and paid off the 30-year mortgage in only a few years, famously. But we also see other spaces more recently, like the One Archives and the June Mazer, which are both in Los Angeles. They're now aligning themselves with universities, University of Southern California and UCLA. Um, and then also there's a move of radical folks who were perhaps aligned with these grassroots spaces going into more, university archives, and then starting to create collections in those spaces as well. And I think, this multiplicity is useful. I mean, I think grassroots archives serve overlapping but different purposes for more traditional spaces. There are ways that university archives and more established archives can sometimes better preserve um, materials, just because of the conditions it takes to preserve things long term. But there is also the sense of, if a state university's politics go against
Mm-hmm.
what happens to these things, right?
Mm-hmm.
So but nothing is, there's there's no safety anywhere. We
Mm-hmm.
I laugh, this is not funny, but you read histories of grassroots newspapers having their offices firebombed, right,
Yeah.
and losing all their records. And so just because it's an independent grassroots archive doesn't mean it's not in danger in other ways as well. And so I think the more places that we can save these things, build in a sense of redundancy, I think the
Hmm.
better off we are.
It absolutely speaks to the energy required to keep going, because it feels like this never ending struggle. But I kind of wanted to pick up on this one thing that you mentioned, this like this brilliant turn of phrase that multiplicity is useful, that you build in this redundancy to kind of ensure survival, but you leverage multiplicity because it's useful for specific things. And it does feel like your writing is almost like this ode to multiplicity. Like there's a part in your introduction where you're thinking with Eve Sedgwick, and you note that there are infinite differences within people, not binary ways of thinking that fix individuals into limited, knowable categories. Like, this isn't even just an aesthetic, political, or like strictly theoretical position. When you look at the work of people like Catherine Malibu, for example, like this perspective on multiplicity really reflects a kind of revolution in neuroscience, even. And I wondered if you could maybe link this idea of infinite differentiation or neuroplasticity and its kind of innumerable iterations to the kinds of things you're saying in the book about the kind of totally singular nature of a hand being brought to a page to create a drawing. Like there's an imprint or a signature in that moment of what you call handmade materiality that you seem to find really powerful. And I've had that experience many times too. And I just wondered if you could kind of speak to whether that's a personal experience for you and what it means to you kind of politically in terms of like the relationship between the hand and transformation.
Oh, this is a fun question because in some ways I'm like pushing against some of the thinkers. There's a women against pornography who are
Mm,
historically in this moment who are very much like, here's what this thing means, and it means one thing. So I'm sort of pushing against that sort of singularity of understanding. But also, a lot of my artists really want to, in their work, they bring together a lot of things in one space. So I start off by talking about the collage work of Mary Beth Nelson and Beth Jaker and Hannah Alderfair in relationships to the sex wars and them, putting collaging together images from feminist pornographers, from traditional pornography, images that are not from pornography, but sort of show a woman's body and sort of create these beautiful collages around these essays. I'm thinking here about Caught Looking,
hmm
and they're sourcing these things from archives, from private collectors, and they're really pushing on there being any sort of one way to read the page or understand the images that they're seeing and the politic of the images that they're seeing. And there's a sense that we're not trying to say this is this is right, this is good politics, but we're trying to say like, well, it's complex, right?
hmm
It's not one thing. It requires there's many ways of looking at this.
hmm
And so, also then you go all the way, through the book and you end with Nan Goldin, who, brilliant photographer, brilliant activist. I mean, you've probably heard of all the work she's been doing against the opioid crisis and the Sacklers recently.
hmm
Um,
hmm
uh, but, for her, she sees herself as she's a photographer, yes, but she sees herself as an editor. And so for her, one of her concepts I find really striking and going against some other photographers at the time is that there's not sort of a definitive moment in taking a photo where you're going to have this perfect view of one person, but it's having multiple images of people over time, right? Accumulating
hmm
of the same person. And then you can perhaps get at a sense of who this person is, right? And so, there's that sense of we need to have a lot. We need to sort of build this large collection of these images. And so, she has uh, some photographs are very famous. Well, she has a lot of photographs that are very famous, but some of them are very famous. There'll be like two different versions of them. And so, when I was getting the permissions for the photographs in my book, I always had to go back and make sure that I was getting the right one because there's multiple on file
hmm
because she has multiple and she's gone through and developed multiple and has them sort of in her collection. Um, and so, I just think for all of these artists, they are very, 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 very invested in, yeah, just, I don't know any other way to put it, but multiplicity, like
Yeah.
having um, different ways of seeing things, of sort of not finding one way of reading something. They were really someone like Alison Bechdel is publishing her comics in grassroots newspapers across the US before there's the internet. And so she sort of has a sense of how things are playing out in different regional conversations. And so she's able to bring those together in her work. And so there's different ways in which we see, um, going back to this statement from Eve Sedgwick that people are different, right? And sort of playing with that difference and respecting the difference,
Yeah.
difference of opinion, difference of experience of the different folks that are being represented.
Yeah, and like a difference too in almost like receptivity, like what a person is going to be receptive to is going to like oscillate depending on like
Yeah.
the way they learn or the experiences that they've had. And I think like the kind of parallel concept to multiplicity in the book is this idea of hybridity, which I loved. Like this idea that some of the texts that really speak to you and that have had this kind of durability are texts that have hybridity in them, in part because hybridity becomes a useful counter to accusations that reduce texts like the diary or Caught Looking to just like one-dimensional pornography or something. Since you brought in Nan Goldin, like I really appreciate how openly you celebrate the work of all the people you write about in this book. I find that refreshing. Everybody receives a lot of love, and maybe none more than Nan Goldin, who you conclude the book with. There's like a certain adulation for what she's accomplished, I think, in terms of just modeling participatory and multiple acts of curation, art making, archiving. And, it comes through everywhere, but especially when you're talking about her best known work, The Ballad of Sexual Dependency, and her Witnesses Against Our Vanishing, and how they both grew and changed in a sort of a relationship, I guess, of responsibility to her community, or what you call this dynamic feedback. And I guess I want to ask you to kind of unwrap that idea a bit, because I don't think it's the conventional way that people think about how art gets made, which maybe speaks to how it was awkward at certain points to just like use conventional ways of securing permissions for using it. Like it's not the case that you're championing the work of one lone genius who captures some deep truth about human experience when it comes to Goldin. And yeah, certainly this idea that she rejects too, that like there is no single decisive moment that reveals some inherent truth. So, I don't know how to frame this as a question, but yeah, like if you wanted to kind of unpack the idea of in Goldin, this like dedication to dynamic feedback, and what you liked about it, or what you found useful politically about that relationship between an artist and her community.
Yeah, no, definitely. So this book is definitely a study of individual artists, but I'm trying to sort of get through them a sense of multiplicity, and a sense of they're very shaped by the community around them, right? I come from a literary studies background. There is a tradition of which is changing, but there used to be a tradition of looking at a single author very deeply. Yeah, I think you said the
Mm-hmm.
low genius,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so I'm sort of pushing it back against that, even if it's sort of one artist on the byline. There's sort of many hands involved, and so for Goldin, she's been very open about a lot of this. So she talks about how she'd share her photos with the folks she took the photos of. And they let her know whether this was, in a private sort of like in the space of the home and she's sharing them with friends, or whether she's doing a public viewing of her photographs that she often did at slideshows, and people are either booing or saying yay, or,
Mm-hmm.
being very excited about a certain photograph or a group of photographs. She's talked about how, folks have said, "Oh, I think your work is about gender." And then that sort of plays into then how she sort of rearranges the photographs and sort of sees them again. And she's also someone, the bout of sexual dependency is super powerful, but one of the powerful elements of it too is how she continues to see the photos in different ways over time and allows them to tell different stories, as the story of her community, which is primarily a family of artists and friends, right? Chosen family. A lot of them are LGBTQ. A lot of them become, stricken by the HIV/AIDS epidemic. And so from sexual liberation to HIV/AIDS, there's a sort of shift, right? And so she gets asked to do exhibit, and she decides in the late 80s to do about HIV/AIDS, and she welcomes artists in to create works from their own experience, and to memorialize, right?
Mm-hmm.
To say we will not vanish. So this is very much in line with what a lot of the political groups we know coming from that time, the sort of sense of documentation, which I think
Mm-hmm.
you find this in a lot of social movements as really powerful. And it's here yet again. And when this exhibit opens, they're doing collaborations with ACT UP, which is a major group that we talk a lot about. And so throughout her work, there's just always her one of her very best friends, Cookie, dies, just as like right as this exhibit is opening. And then a few years later, she puts together this sort of portfolio of photographs of Cookie, who was a huge countercultural figure, had starred in a number of John Waters films, just a major personality. And so then all these early photographs she has of her, and then also the photographs she's taking as she's afflicted with AIDS and is dying, sort of it starts to tell a different story of a person's life, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And so it's really beautiful work, and I'm glad she's been very much in the news recently with a new documentary, and so I'm glad she's a big deal, and I'm glad she's someone that's becoming somewhat of a household name.
For sure. There's the documentary All the Beauty and the Bloodshed, but you also mentioned the relationship to kind of politicizing the opioids crisis. This goal of using visual culture or various kinds of tactics of representation to destigmatize addiction. And that problem of stigma is a kind of through line in the book, certainly. But again, I feel like the book is more a celebration of the kind of, the joys of a political life and being, as you say, shaped by community. But at the same time, there are important resonances with other struggles. Like I see connections between the opposition to pornography and the state's stated opposition to trafficking. Right, in Canada, we have these really kind of draconian anti-trafficking laws that I've spoken with folks like Chanel Gallant and Elaine Lamb about. And what they talk about is how carceral feminism seeks to kind of abolish sex work because it really doesn't understand how these mechanisms of punishment disproportionately harm women of color. Or if it understands them, it doesn't care. And, I wondered if you wanted to talk about how the anti-pornography movement has operated historically. I wonder specifically because, with anti-trafficking laws, the reason why it makes sense to people is that it sounds like protection from violence. And so there is like this paternalistic control that gets mainstreamed through that. And with anti-pornography, it feels as though like that's the position being taken by feminists. But I think from your perspective, that is reductive. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I'll just say I learned a lot from the kind of dialectical way that Imani Perry talks about the kind of problem with pornography in her book Vexy Thing, that of course violence is a problem. Like the representation of violence within pornography, though, can be taken as separate from other forms of pornographic representation. This is a long-winded way of asking you about just the kind of history of the resistance to the anti-pornography movement that you document in the book.
I mean, yeah, it's a lot of things. There are layers to this. I mean,
Yeah.
one of the big sort of coalescences and sort of thing that uh, creates this fracture within the movement is around BDSM sexual practice,
Mm-hmm.
which can involve consensual play between people, which some of it might look like violence to folks sort of outside of that scene. And so some of it's like, you aren't engaging in sexual practice in a way that I understand or can appreciate, right? And so that creates a huge fracture, and people's reputations are threatened. There's a lot of people who are, put on blast. And so it's this sort of, there's not all things are the same, right? And not all, violence is bad, but not all of these things like in sexual practice equate to violence. And so it's very complicated. But I think you were mentioning paternalism, and one thing I've been thinking about a lot recently is sort of been doing some research for a future project, but I was able to go into the archives, the ARQUVIVES in Toronto, which is the long standing queer archives there, which are fantastic, and come out of, were first formed around the Body Politic, which is an important Toronto LGBTQ newspaper, and was sort of their records that started this archival collection.
Right.
But, so the feminists, very much anti-pornography, start to often work with right-wing politicians to make these anti-pornography ordinances. They see these things as violence against women, right? As patriarchal. But then in some ways in the US, some of that stuff gets overturned, but it does come into effect in Canada. And then what happens is then we have who's the people who are then deciding, especially what can cross the border into or out of Canada in the 90s, are usually, the border officials who are, operating in a very paternalistic fashion and are often keeping feminist or queer work from crossing the border. And there's some, the queer bookstores and the feminist bookstores in Canada really suffer. There's a lot of documentation of that in the period. There's some really some very striking examples, like someone like G.B. Jones, who's a queer core artist, very important, has a exhibit done in the US. And so when the exhibit catalogs try to cross the border, they're seized, and then she doesn't necessarily have the money to go get them immediately. And all of them are burned. Right. And so all of that is lost. And it's just been republished recently, that catalog. So for many years, people couldn't get access to that catalog. Is super rare because of this decision at the border. And so I think these things, sometimes there's good intentions behind them, but when you enact them and then you put them in the hands of people, with different political aims, I mean, what happened in these incidents I'm talking about is then queer and feminist people were targeted, right? And their works were targeted, which seems very much against, and it's someone else's idea of what, like, well, this looks to be, problematic, right?
Yeah. And it's interesting to think of like a border patrol agent acting as like a mediary, a kind of activist archivist themselves, but in the opposite direction, right? When we think activists, we often think where our mind goes to the kinds of activists that you're engaging with. But in a sense, these agents are acting to exclude specific texts from the archive as like not just illegitimate, but almost like illegible, like no one can read them. And yeah, I mean, like, this is why I think the method that you're developing in the text in Invisible Archives is so interesting. Like, you are, there's an awareness of the politics of like rethinking methodology or thinking about methodology. And so, like, for example, when you read across archives, in order to parse how archives get constructed and with what sorts of effects, like, I see you sort of experimenting with methodology, meaning that you're saying like there are these patterns that you can see emerge in terms of how particular works get anthologized and archived. And I guess, like, thinking back to writing the book, how much did you need to iterate on your method and develop it to get to a point where you could kind of understand what you were trying to do? Because it does seem kind of subtle and singular in some ways, this idea of like reading across archives to see the patterns in how they're constructed.
I mean, I think that took me a bit of time to understand. So,
Mm-hmm.
this is my first book. It's something that comes out of the work I did for my dissertation, but a lot of the archival methodologies are something I emerged as I was revising this to be a book, and I was trying to think of, I don't want this just to be a case study of something in one archive and it will tell you about what happens if you go research there and what you can find there, but like how can I take my experiences, I've been to dozens of archives now in a lot of different places, sometimes, studying things other than what I'm writing about in this book, but, the experiences in those places do inform how I'm thinking about these things. So how can I sort of come up with these sort of general precepts of what we might think about? And so, when I'm talking about across archives, I sort of developed that idea in relationship to the feminist underground comics because they are definitely collected across many
Mm-hmm.
different collections, but they're collected very differently. And
Right.
so thinking about how that sort of tells stories and it helps us understand how they were received in the moment, but also tells something about their legacy. But also if we start to, this is goes back to this idea of multiplicity or hybridity. Like if we can look across all these different archives and put these things together, maybe we can sort of understand something from like a 360 kind of perspective and sort of see around it or see how all these different ideas of what these works were or who's collecting them and how they're collecting them really inform how they were received, right? And really get at a sense of so the larger conversations with which they were received, some of which, we can find in, you know, grassroots and movement newspapers, but some of which we can grasp by sort of understanding like who was collecting them, where they ended up, how they're described, what sort of things they're collected alongside. All of these things sort of give us a different perspective, but we need to like, do the hard work of, looking across or understanding, um, these things not as in like one place, right? So I am
Mm-hmm.
able to make this argument because a lot of things I'm working with aren't like, you know, unique manuscripts, but they are things that end up in archives because they are rare. They're out of print. Um, there's not that many of them,
Mm.
uh, but they do exist in multiples. And so, sometimes this is yes, go to all the archives you can, but also like as things get digitized, you can visit archives digitally, or you can also visit finding guides digitally. So there are ways to work across archives in digital space as well as in physical space.
Yeah, I think it's really cool. And like the thing too is that the thing you said earlier that like nobody is going to get it right. And so there is this like a kind of passionate rationale, like a spirit of like we need autonomy in archiving or nobody's going to get it right. That I find really interesting because what you're what I read is like you're saying that the way the texts are selected, the way that they're framed and organized, that these things have an impact on how they're interpreted. And if the framing is done in this kind of thoughtless way, then that's weird and it has consequences. And it reminds me too of how, like, when I talked to Rebecca Wanzo about her really great work within comic studies, she sort of recalled how she was told that her subject in the content of our caricature has basically been exhausted. Like, and I can't even imagine the gall of the person that said this to her, like questioning whether there was enough content for a scholarly book within the history of Black comics, basically. Her book is incredibly rich and had to deal like your book with this assumption that comics are somehow juvenile. And what she's saying is that they have this like vital varied history. You have to do the work to collect it. And you also have to reflect critically on where it comes up and why and how, right? Like she talks about Black Panther and the ways in which that film sort of brought things back. But like her book, like yours, is this rigorous study of a history. And I guess I wondered, like, whether you have engaged with books like Wanzo's, whether you kind of can commiserate with this sort of dismissiveness with which comic studies sometimes still gets treated, and how you sort of counter it or deal with it.
I mean, I love Rebecca Wanzo's book. I mean, it's a beautiful book, very well written, very thought provoking. It's also glad to see it has won a bunch of awards, which really testifies to its merit. But one of the things she's doing as well is a lot of very rich archival work, bringing attention to works that have not been as considered, that have been sort of in some ways forgotten, but they're there if you look, right? And if you start to look and tell these stories, you can tell these histories differently. You can bring attention to different to different texts, and comics publishing, like so much publishing. There's just been expansion and excess of publishing, especially in the 20th century. Especially as print technologies develop, as people can publish on their own, can have presses on their own, the mimeograph. There's been a lot of people who do histories of sort of media archaeology and sort of that, allowing there to be so much publishing. So there's just so much comics out there, right? But also, comics are not just for kids. Even the ones that are, because I come from at the University of Florida, we have a huge and long-running tradition not only of comic studies but of children's literature. But what is for children is complicated and nuanced as well.
Very true.
Right. So that's not really, it's sort of a problematic assumption in many ways, right?
Totally, yeah.
Especially when we're talking about banning books and all of this.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I think books like Rebecca Wanzo's, I think there's you could call it a cultural studies turn within comic studies, where we're, understanding the form as there's a desire to, within some of earlier texts of comic studies, to think about why comics are important to study and valorize them sort of as their own important art form. It's sort of similar in some ways to like film studies, right? What is exceptional about a film that differentiates it from other art forms, right? But now, and that's still an important part of the discourse, but some of what folks like Rebecca Wanzo, Ramsey Fawaz, Hilary Shute, Andre Carrington, a lot of other brilliant folks are doing, Derek Scott, I could just name folks all day, every day, is try to think about how these things are operating in culture, to broaden our conversation about who's making comics, who's reading comics, who comics are for, what comics can do, right? Why people, if comics really are just this juvenile thing, which they aren't, and, then why is there a comic in a feminist newspaper, which is just for adults, that's, talking about these very heady concepts? So obviously comics is doing something differently.
Yeah. And I mean, this presumption that it's been exhausted is, I think, kind of like it's ideological, right? Like the idea, you would never say that about like whatever, like William Blake or Immanuel Kant or something, like, because there's just this kind of infinite capital in even citing their names. For example, like I just think there's something there that seeks to dismiss things that are presumed to be fringe. And the book is really rigorous in terms of talking about titles with names like tits and clits very seriously. And I think like that's what's in part refreshing. It's like it's reactivating this work, to use your term, because there's a sincere belief that it is inexhaustibly useful to movements, or to a feeling of like validation, being seen. And also, I mean, this is an episode that's coming out on World AIDS Day. This is a pandemic that is not over, but is sort of felt to be over in some sense. It's memorialized. It's not forgotten, but there's a different sort of temporality to the ways that people engage with the AIDS pandemic, I think. So I think it might be worthwhile to kind of, return to Goldin's work, especially since, as Craig Hubert, I think you cite Craig Hubert says, is like there's this appropriation of Goldin's work happening by the current snapshot obsessed generation who share photos on social media platforms. Like there is a selfie culture that Goldin's work in some ways kind of anticipates, and it is about sort of capturing the self in multiple ways, in multiple contexts and states of being. But also at a time where, coming out of another pandemic, people are experiencing time very differently, and even sort of the feeling of being part of a public differently, I think. And yeah, I mean, the question for me is really around the beauty and the bloodshed, like the mournfulness and the celebration, the emancipatory qualities of Goldin's work, but also the ways in which it's dealing, obviously, with very serious subjects. So I wondered if you could kind of speak to what you call, or what Goldin herself called, her origin story in her older sister Barbara's suicide. But also, since this is a day where we're trying to think through the what AIDS means for a world where the impact, like the COVID-19 pandemic, was like deeply, deeply stratified along lines of gender and race and class and sexuality. How Goldin's work gives us a way into the sort of visceral, emotional, embodied context of the AIDS pandemic that is also attempting to destigmatize what it means to have AIDS.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it's interesting because I like to look at texts in general that have a lot of things going on with them, and someone who's sort of being very quick with them would say, they're not cohesive.
Mm.
How do these things all come together? And so, one could certainly level that critique against Witnesses, which is her exhibit about HIV/AIDS, where she's inviting all these artists together, and it's opens in late '89. But part of it is she really wants to show, well, she wants to give her artists free reign, right, to decide how they want to respond creatively on their own terms, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's not just, advocating against HIV/AIDS is not just about showing, people who are sick, right, who are dying. It's
Right.
about also showing someone like Peter Hujar, um, who is a mentor to Nan Goldin, a photographer himself, and just showing photographs from him in the 70s, right? Earlier
Mm-hmm.
photographs of him in this exhibit, attesting to his long-standing career, right? Making that available, showing, the huge loss that we had by losing him, versus also folks who, like Vittorio Scarpati, who are in the hospital making cartoons that are talking about what it's like to be ill, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in
Mm-hmm.
that sort of visceral moment. And so, there's a capacity for what it means to be HIV/AIDS artwork to be very vast, right?
Mm.
And this is what, this is at a time too where the organization Visual AIDS, which is an amazing organization, is developing. And they also have that sort of same um, sort of space and range of like, what does it mean to be an artist doing work in relationship to HIV, AIDS,
Mm-hmm.
or, if you're HIV positive, like what sort of work is sort of relevant to this conversation. And so I think that's, I think there's many ways that we can sort of uh, take this, and many ways that, Goldin in her own work is, she has friends that, in the 90s where they are ill, and so she'll document them over a period of time, and we sort of have this documentary sense of their illness and its progression, versus someone like Cookie after her death, where she's putting in all these, older photographs, right, and really giving us a sense of what we lost from this person who, died when she was 40,
Mm-hmm.
who in some ways was very much, and I talk about this a little bit, and other folks have said it certainly, was very much like a sister for her, right? And was able to live her life on her own terms, unlike her sister, who was older than Goldin, who committed suicide as a teen. In some ways, in reaction to not really being able to rebel, being able to be who she was. And so, Goldin runs away from home. This is like, she talks about this a lot. This is her origin story.
Yeah.
And so being able to sort of determine the shape of your life on your own terms, right? And so, it's just what aids activism as visual praxis means is so expansive for Goldin, right? It's going to be meditating on loss and showing sort of the range of what these people are doing. But also, I think something that's super important within her work is she's always pushing back against this idea, that their work isn't universal, that's marginalized, right?
Mm-hmm.
And saying like, no, though we are the world. This is a world of this is important, vital world. There is something that's universal within this work. Also, universal is its own sort of problematic concept anyway, right?
Of course, yeah.
What's get canonized, what doesn't, and so I think. She really brings us to sort of think expansively about what it might mean to create a art in the face of the AIDS pandemic, right? And to think about what might be sort of relevant to the discourse.
Yeah, and it's like expansive, and then there's also, you point out, like a spirit of just refusal. Like you say, Goldin refused to allow HIV/AIDS to remain a shameful private matter. And I think like that refusal is really a force in your book. There's just like a celebration of that spirit of refusal, like a refusal to be invisibilized, to have your archive burned, to have your memory like immolated by these forces that feel threatened by it. And like the counter to that clearly is this idea that you mentioned of like a chosen family. And I think like there's something simple and beautiful about this idea of a chosen family. And in some sense, like that's like what an archive is to some extent. Like, and my last question is really about, how, because this is a book that, as you say, you rewrote from your dissertation, but it's now part of an archive, and is functioning as like constructing an archive. I spoke with Kathy Weeks a while ago for the podcast, and she talked about how an archive is for her this autonomous and kind of idiomatic thing, that she likes the word archive because it doesn't feel like a tradition, an inheritance, a lineage, a canon. It feels precisely like not those things, which have this kind of reproductivist, like patriarchal quality. Do you see any kind of connections between that idea of like a chosen family and an archive? And thinking back, like, how do you feel about the place of invisible archives in relationship to the archives you're referencing? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think for me, thinking about, lineage, inheritance as being sort of, traditional top-down vertical modes of inheritance, right, that are sort of
Sure.
Limited, right,
Mm-hmm.
in sort of who they reach. One of the concepts that sort of undergirds some of this thinking, but not is sort of direct way, is this idea of like horizontal relationships. This is something that is very much inspired and influenced by my dissertation director, Nancy K. Miller, who does amazing, beautiful work on autobiography and trauma studies and just a lot of different things. But thinking about sort of these horizontal modes of inheritance, right? When you're building, when you have to sort of build your own sort of chosen family, or you're sort of in movement with a lot of different folks, and those people are sort of family to you, and they're all sort of at that same sort of space and time. And so it's sometimes in genealogies you're trying to document what came before you and sort of create this sort of line of understanding, and certainly we want to do that too, but there's a sense in this time that we need to document what's around us, right, but also to remember it, right, for for the future, for the past, but like we need to sort of encapsulate the whole of what's happening at the same time, because if we don't do it, who will? right? This stuff isn't necessarily going to be saved. And in fact, this is a moment too where, early gay lesbian studies, people are trying to, find out about, people who were gay or lesbian in the past, who perhaps were, hidden, or their legacies were constrained. And so it's a moment where we're sort of opening up all of that conversation, finding these objects from earlier moments in time, but we need to then look around us and make sure all of this gets saved too. And so that's sort of the artists are documenting in their work as well.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Margaret. It's been a real pleasure talking to you about this book. I really enjoyed reading it.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was, it's always great fun to talk about something you spend so much time on and to think about it in a different way.